We are in Isaiah as we have been studying this text for a couple months now, and we're kind of taking big pieces of the puzzle now because we've kind of got the imagery, right? God's bringing judgment, there's going to be a remnant, and ultimately Jesus is going to be the greatest gift that God gives to that remnant, and that ultimate remnant that comes in the time that Jesus arrives. And so that's kind of the main theme, and it just keeps getting threaded through all the chapters and everything that he talks about. Those basic same principles just keep coming up throughout the narrative. And so we're able to move a little more quickly because of that. And we covered a good bit of ground last Wednesday, but I do want to go back since we did cover a lot of ground, and I want to look for a moment with you, not at that, at the questions for chapters 9 through 12, which is what we covered last week. And so that's the review we'll do. If you have your workbook sheets, this would be page 25, I believe. Page 25 in the workbook. It's the questions for chapters 9 through 12 that we're going to look at, and we're going to start with question 13. So you're looking at the actual number and question that we're dealing with. And again, that should be page 25 if I'm correct. Can I see yours real quick just to make sure I'm right about that? Yes. So it's marked at the bottom as page 25, and it'll be the questions starting for the questions for chapter 9 here in this text. Okay, so the first question for chapter 9 was simply this. What hope was offered to those who lived in Galilee, northern Israel, and when was this prophecy fulfilled? Okay, and so it would become glorious. What was going to come? What would it called it? It's the birth of Christ is what they're pointing to, but I think the word in the text is that it was a light. A light was coming to the darkness that was among them, and that light would ultimately be Jesus. What would the child or son who would govern be called in verse 6?
Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace.
That is correct. That's all four of them. Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. Now, it's interesting. We necessarily talk about this when we went through that the first time, but it's interesting to note that in that moment, he references this coming light, this glorious light that is coming for the darkness, but he references him as what in that list? That seems interesting because we think of him, Jesus, as always being the Son, but how's he listed there? Mighty God and Everlasting Father. When we don't ever lose sight of the fact that when Jesus came to this earth, that was God made manifest in the flesh. It's the personage of His Son, but it is God that walked among men when Jesus arrived on the scene. And I think that's an important aspect of fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecies when Jesus arrives, and why His name was called Emmanuel, which is, by interpretation, God with us. That's correct. Question 15 said, what would be the nature of His government in verse 7 of chapter 9? Okay, it was just and fair and peaceable and endless. Right? That most nations generally, they have a beginning, but every great nation that has ever been on the face of God's earth since its creation also had an end. The only one that won't is the one that Jesus will establish. And that's part of this prophecy that he speaks of as it relates to Jesus. Why would judgment come upon Israel, that northern kingdom there in chapter 9? I think really you can sum it up in two words. They were these two things. They were proud and arrogant, and that's kind of the same idea. What's the other thing that came up in those verses? They would not turn to Him, which means they were rebellious, right? If you think about them in terms of their description, they're really just kind of two that jump out at you. Their pride and their rebellious spirit is what led them to this consequence and judgment that was coming. And by the way, we're speaking about Israel, the northern, even though Isaiah spends most of his time dealing with Judah, there's this interlude here in his prophecies where his emphasis is on that those northern tribes, that northern kingdom of Israel. And we'll see more of that before we're done. What means would God use to chasten Israel there in chapter 9, verses 11 and 12 and 19 to 21? Okay, he'll use their enemies, whom, by the way, okay, the Syrians, right? They were part of that, and they would begin to overwhelm them, and they would also do something else if you read those verses. Ephraim against Manasseh, Manasseh against Ephraim, which meant what? Right, interfighting. They're going to turn on themselves. So they're going to have the Syrians coming, this outside force that God will use to bring judgment on Israel, but they will have weakened themselves before they ever arrive there because of the infighting that was going on among the people. What other misdeeds of Israel angered God there in verses 1 through 4 of chapter 10? Okay, unrighteous decrees, and then what was the other aspect? Okay, yeah, they would prey or oppress what three entities? The poor, the orphans, and the widows, right? What a wonderfully kind and merciful bunch they were, right? That they would actually prey upon the weakest and most vulnerable among them. No wonder God judged them for that kind of behavior that was going on. What repeated phrase was done 4 times to show that worse was yet to come? What's the phrase that was used in those verses listed there? 9, 12, 17, 21, and 10 verse 4. Okay, that's right. For all this, his anger is not turned away. And you see that phrase in all 4 of those verses noted there. How did God view Assyria in his plans? According to chapter 10, verses 5 and 6. There's 2 words I think that he used there. They would be a rod, that's right, and a staff are the words that he used there in that text as it relates to the judgment he would bring. How did the king of Assyria view his conquests? How do they view their own conquest and what they were able to do? That it came through what? Their own power, right? That was the problem that God's going to have to deal with them on, is they never gave God credit for what he empowered them to do. They took all the credit for themselves. What would God do to the king of Assyria once his work on Jerusalem was done in verse 12? Hey, he'll bring punishment to him too. And so, by the way, Isaiah's narrative throughout this passage, it jumps all over history, okay? One minute he's talking about Israel, which happens many, many years prior to what he's dealing with now with Assyria, which happens years later to Judah. He's not really worried about chronology here. He's just kind of jumping all over the history, talking about the judgments and things that God will eventually accomplish. What would be the end result of God's use of Assyria on Israel? And it's that recurring theme that we always come back to. There'll be a remnant, right? That's what you see there in verses 20 through 23. So what does the Lord tell his people who live in Zion or Jerusalem? There at in verses 24 through 27 of chapter 10. Okay, so just be patient and what? Endure it. Just endure it. Because it's coming whether you... no matter what you do, it's coming. The judgment's coming. So just be patient and endure it, because it is not endless. It has an end point. And God will limit it and resolve it eventually. When the king of Assyria made his way near Jerusalem, what would he do? If you go into verses 28 through 32, it'll tell us about what he'll do. He'll get to a place called Nod. And he'll do something towards Jerusalem. He'll shake his hand. He'll shake his fist at them. Right? He'll shake his hand at Jerusalem because Nod is right on the doorstep, okay? And so he's able, and this, by the way, Assyria, we're not to Babylonians yet, right? That's Nebuchadnezzar, so we're not there yet. This Assyrian king is most likely Sennacherib, okay? And it's hard sometimes. Are you dealing with names? Are you dealing with titles? And all the variations that come. You go back into the various readings within Scripture, and you can see some of that. But in 2 Kings chapter 19, I did not talk about this last week, and because this question addresses this, let me just run your minds to that narrative for a minute. In 2 Kings chapter 19, Hezekiah is king over Judah, and Isaiah, our prophet that we're talking to, has to come to Hezekiah, because Hezekiah is frantic. He sees Sennacherib, he sees the Assyrians coming. They've already conquered all of Israel, okay, that's gone. And now they're on the doorstep. They've been going through smaller cities, even some fortified cities of Judah, and they're having success, and Hezekiah is convinced they're coming for Jerusalem and we can't stop them. And Isaiah comes to Hezekiah in 2 Kings chapter 19 and says, listen, calm down. That's the Brian Price translation, by the way. But he says, calm down. God's not ready for that to happen yet. It's not going to happen. And God stops the Assyrians right there at Nod. Doesn't let them pursue on into Jerusalem yet. It's not time for that. Now, after Hezekiah is a decent guy, you're going to run into Manasseh, right? You're going to run into some guys that horrible, horrible kings. And because of their behaviors, the judgment ultimately come, but not yet. In fact, I believe he gives Hezekiah about 15 more years to reign over the people. And so the Assyrian king shaking his hands. He thinks he's got it. Add 2 Kings chapter 19 and you realize, nope. God says, you're not going any further. You've conquered all of Israel. You've started to make your way into Judah. That's it. You're not coming any farther. And he stops him right there in his tracks and gives Judah a little more time period before they ultimately fall into captivity. What would the Lord do in return? Verses 33 through 34 of chapter 10. That's kind of what I've been talking about. Yeah, cut them down, stop their progress. And later, through the Babylonians, under Nebuchadnezzar, eventually they'll fall. But for now, he's going to stop that conquest and protect them. What was to come from the roots of Jesse? That's right. It was a rod and a branch, which ultimately is whom? Jesus, right? That was to come. What was to rest upon him? Yeah, Spirit of the Lord, and what would be his delight? In the fear of the Lord. But notice, so it was the Spirit of the Lord, if you go back in that text. Spirit of the Lord, Spirit of wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge. If you look at that text, it lists all of those things, which were the descriptive words of that coming light that he spoke of earlier. And he just re-describes those very same things. And his delight would be in the fear of the Lord. How shall he judge the poor and meek? Yeah, with righteousness and equity, right? Not this oppressive mannerisms that they had. He's going to come with righteousness and fairness. And what's he going to use rather than a sword? His breath or his mouth, his words, right? He's going to use his message, his mouth, in order to be able to fulfill those purposes. How is the peaceful nature of his kingdom depicted in verses 6 through 9 of chapter 11? Say it again.
Wolf will dwell with the lamb.
Okay. Right. The wolf will dwell with the lamb. And he gives all that big long list basically of things that generally can't what? Can't get along or exist together. They can't cohabitate. Who's going to put their child on over top of a pit of snakes and say, stick your hand in there, it'll be all right? What seemingly is an impossibility, he says in the prophecy, will absolutely be possible in Jesus. Not these specific things. We're not going to throw real lions and lambs in the same pile and have children thrust their hands down in. And no, what he's saying is things that seemingly could never make peace with one another under Jesus can. Jew and Gentile are exactly what he has in mind when it comes to that point. Who shall seek the root of Jesse in verse 10? Yeah, people of all nations, right? Everybody gets to come and have an opportunity to seek him. And what is said of his resting place? It's glorious, all right? This glorious resting place that he offers. Whom shall the Lord set his hand to recover a second time? Yeah, the remnant of his people. There's some debate about which remnant is he referring to here. I don't know if we can get any precise answer to that, but he's definitely talking about a remnant in that moment. And finally, lightning round is almost over. In that day, what would the remnant do? Say it one more time. Okay, they'll find comfort, but there's something specific they're going to do. Yeah, they're going to praise the Lord. They're going to sing a song of praise, the text says there in verses 1 and 4. They're going to sing a song of praise, and they're going to exalt the name and declare his name among the people for all that he has done. All right, now all that's fresh in your minds, right? It's kind of what we were trying to do by answering all those questions. That's what we talked about last week. Okay, that was last week's discussion. Let's go now that we've refreshed all of that and kind of get this picture of what Isaiah's been telling them. And let's, over the next 30 minutes or so here, look at some things. Oh, I'm down to 20, ain't I? Never mind. Okay, so I may have to find a better way. I may just give you answer keys when you walk in on Wednesday nights instead of running all those like that in the future. But Isaiah chapter 13 is about judgment against Babylon. And again, we're not doing verse by verse. I'm going to try to hit moments that help us understand these passages. So notice verse 3 of chapter 13. I have commanded my consecrated ones, yea, I have called my mighty men for mine anger, even my proudly exalting ones. God says, I may use Babylon for a moment, but then I can call other mighty men to come and address and deal with them just as I have with others. Nothing's prohibitive when it comes to what God is able to do. He speaks about the idea that the day of Jehovah is at hand. The day of God, the day of the Lord is at hand. And any time that God decides to bring a judgment, he brings a judgment. And whatever tool or method or what people he chooses to use, he has liberty to do that. Notice verse 6 of chapter 13. Wail ye, for the day of Jehovah is at hand, as destruction from the Almighty shall it come. This time, these nations have convinced themselves that they're the real power behind all this. That all their successes and their conquests and their abilities to overwhelm other peoples was all about them, and never gave real consideration to the fact that it was all about God and his purposes. And once he's fulfilled those purposes through one nation, if they decide to reject him, he can use another to bring consequence to them, and another to bring consequence to them, which is kind of what we're going to see over these next several chapters. It's just chapter after chapter after chapter of God saying, I'm coming to take care of you. Now I'm coming to take care of you. And now I'm coming to take care of you. And he just lists them all down through the prophecy. And it's interesting when he describes this power, he talks about the fact that he's going to come with wrath and fierce anger. Verse 9, behold, the day of Jehovah cometh, cruel, with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and to destroy the sinners thereof out of it. It's Old Testament's interesting sometimes, right? we think about the mercy and the grace and the loving kindness that is poured forth when Jesus arrives, when that great and glorious light, that root of Jesse that this text has been talking to us about. But there's an absolute fierceness about our God that you cannot deny. And I think it's hard sometimes for us to appreciate, but God, this is God making decisions and choices through His righteousness. This isn't men deciding they are the utensil or weapon of God, where men are arbitrarily making that decision on their own. Isaiah isn't talking about men making decisions that they attributed to God. He's talking about things that God did. This is what God, and that seems maybe splitting some hairs, but I think it's a differentiation we need to appreciate. That men can do all kinds of horrible things, devastating things, destructive things. And they could say, well, God told me to do it. Well, notice the interesting part here. Nobody throughout all this is saying God told me to do it. In fact, those who are being used to bring this destructive are actually denying God throughout the whole process. God is in control of this process. This is God's decision making. Go ahead, Bill.
That what they were doing was God's bidding, not theirs.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And this is a direct message to the Jews, the Israelites. This is from God. This is, and because they were even not giving God necessarily that this was coming from Him either. They were fearing these people and not.
They had spent a lot of time and energy trying to make alliances and afraid of what these nations around them might do, rather than just respecting what God could do. And He's about to show them what He can do. But it's powerful. And in His fierce anger, He says, He's coming. It's an aspect of God you cannot deny. And He says, I'm going to use the Medes to do it. Right? Babylonian time period, then the Medo-Persians, then the Greeks, right? And then the Romans, and that's when Jesus arrives. Now you can add Daniel's prophecies in relationship to understanding that approach to time. But that's basically it, right? Babylonians are going to run for a while and going to have some great success, but God says, they didn't give me credit for it. I'm going to judge them, and He brings in the Medes in order to handle that. Behold, I will stir up, verse 17, the Medes against them, who shall not regard silver, and as for gold, they shall not delight in it. Why do you think He says that, by the way? If you read that section of that chapter. They're not even concerned about silver or gold. What are they concerned about? No, I'm not trying to be overly dramatic here.
It's destroyed.
That's right. They're not even worried about the spoil. I think that's the imagery here. They're not interested in what value they may gain. They are just vicious. They are vicious fighters. And when they come, they're not concerned. I'll stir up those meat, and they won't even be thinking about whether they're going to receive some kind of gold or silver in relationship to it. They're just going to come in and bring utter destruction when they come. So much so that it's described or compared to what? I put it on the screen. It's just Sodom and Gomorrah, which was utter destruction, right? Utter destruction. And it seems like anytime God wants people to get it about the kind of destructive path that He's going to bring, that's the reference He uses. And my conclusion about that is, because every audience He says it to, their mind can immediately understand what He's talking about. When you reference something to this audience of people that Isaiah is dealing with, the New Testament writers were dealing with, when you say Sodom and Gomorrah, they knew it. They knew what happened there. They knew the destructive power of God. So it makes sense. There will be things in our history that if we reference, they would immediately conjure certain imageries, right? If I say 9/11, instant imageries into our minds. That's what Sodom and Gomorrah was to them. You could say it and they understood it. Go ahead.
You know, he talks about they're going to destroy Babylon and the glory and the beauty of their kingdom. It just made me think, if you know the ancient wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon was one of those. And so you get, again, an image of the glory of this Babylonian empire, and it's just going to be gone.
Yeah.
And that's really what he says in verse 19. In Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. It doesn't matter how powerful, how glorious, how grand, how beautiful, how prosperous any nation becomes, when they choose to not exalt God, they can what? They can be destroyed. And if you or I have any questions about them, just read these texts that we're studying. They illustrate it over and over and over again. What happens to people, nations, when they exalt themselves above God. And even when He uses them for a period of time for good. If they choose to not honor that good, He can come back and create consequence, which He has been doing. Questions up to that point in the prophecy? Thoughts you might have had, things I might have missed.
Don't look back, don't look back.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
So chapter 14 talks about how Israel will find mercy. It's interesting, right? Because God's pretty frustrated with His own people. Israel first, Judah next. But they're still what? Yeah, they're still Him. They're still His people, and there will always be this remnant. And He, in the midst of all this destructive judgment that He's talking about, He keeps referencing whom that's coming? Jesus, right? He keeps referencing Jesus that is coming, and He's using whom to get Him there? These people we're talking about, right? He's using this Israelite nation to bring about the heritage that will lead to Jesus. He's not done with that promise yet. That promise was made to whom? Abraham. That promise was made to Abraham. And God's not going to turn from that promise. And He's going to fulfill it. So He may have to bring some judgments to recalibrate them a little bit here and there. But He's not given up completely on them. For Jehovah will have compassion. Notice verses 1 and 2 of chapter 14. Jehovah will have compassion on Jacob, and will yet choose Israel and set them in their own land. And the sojourner shall join himself with them, and they shall cleave to the house of Jacob. And the people shall take them and bring them to their place. And the house of Israel shall possess them in the land of Jehovah, for servants and for handmaids. And they shall take them captive, whose captives they were, and they shall rule over their oppressors. It's interesting, right? Because what they are now, captives and oppressed and challenged, God says, once that judgment's over, I'll just flip the tables. And you will now actually be those who are ruling over those who once oppressed you. And He begins then to write this, what we might call a song. Some translations use parable. Others, I think, use the word proverb in the midst of chapter 14 here. And so you can see this poetic nature, I guess, is what we need to understand here. When he begins this next segment, this is prophecy, and it's Isaiah's message, but it's poetic. It's parable, it's proverb, it's song. And needs to be viewed and understood that way. In verse 5, he said, Jehovah has broken the staff of the wicked. In verse 7, the people break out then in song for the peace that God has brought to them. Those who have been challenging the people, God's going to deal with and bring judgment. And when He does, the people, Israel, will sing songs of glory before the throne of God for His mercy and His grace. And I think the lesson for us simply is this, that we need to probably be spending more time exalting and praising the name of Jehovah. And being thankful that, yes, at times we had to be chastised and disciplined and corrected, not unlike the Israelites, but if we'll accept His restoration and His mercy and His grace, then His name is worthy to be exalted. And that's the imagery that He shares with them. In verse 7, they break out in song for the peace that God has brought to them. And it's interesting. Again, remember, it's poetic, okay? This is proverbial, parable, song, literature. And so, basically, the dead begin to mock at Babylon's fall in this proverb, this parable that he's saying. Notice verse 9. Sheol, death, the grave, from beneath is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming. It stirreth up the dead for thee. He's talking about Babylon. The Sheol's ready for you. The grave's ready for you. It stirreth up the dead for thee, even all the chief ones of the earth. It hath raised up from their thrones all the kings of the nations. All those kings where you all thought you were so much more powerful than any other king that walked the earth. You had so much greater might, and you were just had so many. Those other kings that have died before you, they're all going to be right there. When Babylon arrives, they're all going to be right there. All that shall answer and say unto thee, art thou also become weak as we? I guess Babylon isn't above what has come to all of humanity. They suffer the same consequences of mankind as others. Art thou become like unto us? Thy pomp is brought down to Sheol? What happened to all the celebration? What happened to all the glory that was with you? The noise of the vials. The worm is spread under thee, and worms cover you. We've always said death's a great equalizer, right? For people who think they're better and higher and mightier and more powerful and greater than others and always are oppressing and looking down upon other people. Sheol awaits. The proverb says, the Isaiah, the prophecy says, even for great Babylon and its great rulers that they have. A powerful then, yet I would say confusing metaphor happens in verse 12. And I want to pause long enough. I didn't get nearly as far tonight, but that's okay. Because we need to talk about this just for at least a minute. Because he says, how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground which didst weaken the nations? Now, if you're not holding King James, you probably don't see that, do you? In that text. Right? New King James uses Lucifer as well. And probably the only two that do. King James and New King James. Probably the only two. Anybody got an American Standard or something like that in their hands? Everybody's got a King James. Yeah, that's okay, Bob. I'm just asking. Okay. Some translations use this star of the morning imagery. This text says son of morning. Here's the point we need to make as we've got a few more minutes here. When you hear the name Lucifer, what do you think of? The devil. Why? Because of man. Where? No, he's not. No, he's not. This is the only text in Scripture that uses that name. And he's not referring to Satan here. Who's he referring to? He's referring to Babylon. We believe it's in the Bible. Because man uses it over and over and over and over and over again to reference Satan. He's not referencing Satan. He's referencing Babylon. And to my knowledge, and I used eSword and I looked and I popped up extra translations to make sure I was searching. And I searched just to be sure. I was pretty sure, but I wanted to double check. I typed in Lucifer and I searched for it in multiple translations, in multiple texts. This is it. King James, New King James, only text in all of the Bible that I'm aware of, through the research I did this afternoon and this morning. And you would think that we have Tons of them, right? Dozens and dozens of texts that refer to Lucifer or Satan as Lucifer. Now, I understand how people draw that conclusion. Because of the poetic nature of this, what's Lucifer doing here? He's falling from heaven. Well, our minds immediately go to the idea that, well, that's what kind of happened with Satan, right? He was an angel of God and created being of God that chose to not honor God, and he fell from that. And there is some imagery in Scripture that illustrates that. The problem is there's no connectivity between Isaiah 14:12 and any of those other texts. Basically, he says, how Babylon? How, O Lucifer? When you were the brightest star in the sky, which is to the earth is the sun. What comes up in the morning? The sun. O Lucifer, son of the morning. This enormous star that seemingly could never fall. In fact, we understand the science behind God has created this universe, and if that sun falls, we're in trouble, right? It's all over. But that's the intricate way God created and designed His universe. All the prophecy is trying to get us to see here is, even as great as Babylon was, son of the morning, this great star of the heavens that seemingly could never fall, just fell when the Medes come and the judgment of God arrives. That's the imagery. And I wanted to pause because I knew, right? And it's that time of year. and your mind just goes there. And just be careful. Because sometimes men get in their minds certain facts that they believe are established within Scripture. And you hear them long enough, and generally, if you want a lie to become true in the minds of men, just do what? Just say it enough. If you just keep repeating it, somewhere somebody will convince it's true. And so be careful. I don't believe he's got any reference to Satan in this text at all. And this is the only text that ever uses the name Lucifer. Men have then conjured out of their own minds what they think certain things mean and have context to. How is it, Babylon, that you could be cut down to the ground? How is it that you could be weakened like every other what? Like every other nation. Like all those other kings in Sheol that are just sitting there looking, here he comes. Here comes Nebuchadnezzar and all those great leaders of Babylon. Here they come just like all the rest of us here in the grave. That's the poetic picture that Isaiah is trying to get them to see. Yeah. All right, I'll come back then. Didn't get nearly as far this week as we did. No. Babylon he's not even referring to that same imagery of the bright and morning star that is Jesus. He is using poetic language to say Babylon, that great Lucifer, that great morning star, the sun that seemingly what could ever happen to it can fall. And that's there is well, and all I'm saying, Bob, is this is not literal. This is poetic language to draw a picture so that people could see here's this sun, this enormous star in the sky, the morning, the dawn of the day, this great and glorious kingdom, Babylon, and it can fall just like the rest of them. And I think simplistically, that's the imagery. And he just uses language and interesting. And by the way, the word that gets rendered Lucifer here, by the way, just to give you a quick rundown, it's the only time that it's referenced as a noun in this text. The only other times it's used, it's a verb in the way the word is used. So it's just an interesting kind of thing. But the biggest thing I wanted to make sure we dispelled was that there's no connectivity that I can even remotely find with this verse and Satan. The conversation is about Babylon. And any conclusion or definition that we place on the text needs to reference them because they're the ones under discussion. And we may vary. It's hard sometimes when you're dealing with poetic language to know exactly what is he referring. But Babylon, without question, is the people and the kings of Babylon that are under discussion in the text. Those are all good questions. Like I said, Lord willing, we'll come back to that next week.